Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of our webinar series, Shaping Business Sustainability Amidst COVID-19. Massive thanks to Mazars for this great collaboration. I trust you're all keeping well and staying safe, particularly as the South African winter chill takes hold. And, you know, with violent storms raging across Cape Town, I couldn't help but be reminded that Cape Town remains the most unequal city in the world. Maybe, you know, made much more so by the COVID-19 pandemic. And whilst we might bemoan having our freedoms restricted by the lockdown and having to spend much more time at home, many people will be without permanent residence throughout this winter, and many will struggle to find shelter. And this problem is only getting worse, and certainly not confined to South Africa. I think the Black Lives Matter protests sweeping the globe are testament to an increasing frustration with the status quo, and particularly with structural inequality along racial lines. A return to business as usual is now, I think, highly unlikely. But this could be a unique opportunity to make a meaningful, positive change. The pandemic has accelerated new business models and opened up considerable dialogue around the role and the responsibilities of big business in society. So the question needs to be asked as to what we as business can do differently to ensure that we are better prepared to withstand potential future disruptions of this magnitude. And that includes environmental and economic disruption, you know, like COVID-19 or even the recent Cape Town water crisis that many people will remember, or societal disruption, you know, because of race protests or rampant inequality and injustice in society. It's just simply not sustainable, the trajectory that we're currently on or were on. So today's webinar is taking an honest, hard look at this from a bottom-line shareholder value perspective. What is current thinking around how company value is defined for investment purposes? And is sustainability a key consideration for investors and shareholders? Is there a case for responsible investing? And could that include aspects beyond the current focus only on the green economy? As we're seeing, the challenges and the problems that we're facing as a society are far beyond, you know, continuing to burn coal. There are fundamental structural inequalities that, unless we redress them fairly urgently and perhaps, you know, use this opportunity for a pause and a reset constructively, we may be in for much more severe disruption in the not so distant future. Okay, so with that context set, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. We've got a fantastic audience today, a full room. So please do use the chat and Q&A functionality to pose questions, or even just to share your views and thoughts and comments. And bear in mind, you know, all views are welcome. This is meant to be a constructive discussion and debate, and certainly I don't imagine we'll solve all the world's problems today, but certainly we want to hear your thoughts and engage. The session will be recorded and available on YouTube and our webpage as usual. So, you know, please do feel free to share your thoughts, if not on this webinar, on future topics and other aspects that you would like to engage in. Okay, so let's kick off. We've got two fantastic speakers today, certainly well qualified to guide us through this discussion. So first up today, we have Leila Camden-Fotso coming to us from London, and providing a bit of a global UK-EU perspective on the matter. Leila is a partner at Mazars, London office, with 14 years of experience in the financial services practice. She advises banks in the UK and across Europe on the implementation of climate change regulations and sustainability standards. She was responsible for co-leading the Mazars OMFIF, Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum study on banking regulation and supervision in relation to climate change. I'll post a link to that study in the comment box, in the chat box, if anybody would like to go and have a look at that. Certainly well worth the read. Leila has led the delivery of several assignments on behalf of regulators and public authorities, including the Prudential Regulatory Authority, the European Commission, and Her Majesty's Treasury in the UK. Leila is a French chartered accountant with a master's in accounting and finance. Good morning, Leila. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And on that note, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for the kind introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining us on this webinar today. I'm just going to share my screen now. So we are on the brink of a sustainability revolution, and we all need to get ready. And this revolution, as Ryan was alluding to it, was actually mentioning it in his introduction, is driven by the combination of many factors, including climate change, but also growing and aging global population, scarcity of natural resources, and rising inequality. And among all these factors, climate change has been identified by many scientists and governments and international institutions as the most serious threat to our society and the number one priority. Whether you're skeptical or convinced about the reality of climate change, really, it no longer matters, because there is such profound disruption happening in many sectors of our economies that it would be irresponsible to manage a company today without considering whether your business model is resilient to this transformation. So for this reason, and in the interest of time today, we're going to focus on climate change. For the next 18, obviously that's without, I should say, we obviously recognize that sustainability is a broader topic, and it encompasses all environmental, social, and governance issues. So for the next 18 minutes or so, we're going to explore, first of all, the ways in which climate change affects financial stability and financial performance, then the crucial importance of climate-related disclosures in the fight against climate change, and lastly, a brief overview of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, the TCFD recommendations. So in the Stern Review report issued in 2006, so 14 years ago now, Lord Nick Stern said that climate change was the greatest market failure, the world had ever seen. And the problem of climate change is a fundamental failure of markets. Most of the impacts of emissions do not fall on those conducting the activities that emit carbon. Instead, they fall on future generations, or they fall on people living in developing countries, for example. So those responsible for the emissions do not pay the cost. And the adverse effects of greenhouse gases are therefore external to the market, which means there is usually only an ethical incentive instead of an economic one for businesses and consumers to reduce their emissions. And as a result, the market fails by overproducing greenhouse gases. So last year, in collaboration with earlier this year, in collaboration with a think tank called UMFIF, Mazar conducted a survey of 33 central banks across the globe to understand whether central banks were responding to this market failure. And one of the result of the outcome of the study was that after years of debate, 70% of central banks now recognize climate change as a major threat to financial stability. So the question is no longer if central banks should act on climate change and address the issue, but what measures should be taken. And this is driven, so the climate threat to financial stability and financial performance is driven by two main factors: physical risks and transition risks. On the physical risk side, the increased frequency and severity of climate events, such as droughts. Ryan mentioned the water crisis in Cape Town, and that made the news headlines across the globe. But also floods, hailstorms, the fires in Australia that we all witnessed last year. So all these increasingly frequent and more severe climate events represent a threat to water supply, to agriculture, to coastlines and infrastructure, and financial performance as a whole. On the other hand, on the transition risk side, the South African economy, if we take it as an example, is threatened by changes in policies as countries work towards the Paris Agreement, but also by technological innovation and changing consumer preferences. All these changes could, for example, reduce demand for South Africa's carbon-heavy natural resources, such as coal. And the COVID crisis is also in many ways a real-life stress test of a climate shock, particularly on the transition-related side. So we have seen the massive slowdown in carbon-heavy industries in recent months. We also note that some countries have announced measures to attach green conditions to bailout packages. For example, in France for the airline industry. And the crisis is really seen by many as an opportunity to build back a better and greener world. While this would reduce the physical risks of climate change, that would also mean an increase in transition risks. So this needs to be taken into account. To illustrate this further, we have here the 3 transition scenarios defined by the Bank of England to measure the risks facing the financial system, depending on the degree of action taken to mitigate climate change. The first scenario is business as usual or no action. So this is the red line on this chart. Under this scenario, governments fail to introduce policies to address climate change. Companies and consumers do not change their behaviors to reduce emissions. There is also limited technological transition. And as a result, the climate target is not met and the global average temperature increases substantially by 2080. Therefore, under this scenario, there are limited transition risks, obviously, because there's very limited transition happening. But the economies will suffer from more significant physical risks due to more frequent and extreme weather events. The second scenario is the disorderly or late policy action scenario. We're now looking at the yellow line. Under this scenario, action to address climate change is delayed by 10 years to 2030. And to compensate for the delayed start, a deeper adjustment is required, as you can see with the steep decrease in global emissions from 2030. So the government is going to start increasing carbon prices very sharply. Companies and consumers will change their behavior in a very dramatic manner as well, and asset prices will see a sharp repricing as a result. And this would lead to a macroeconomic shock. The climate target is still going to be met, and global average temperature increases are going to be limited to below 2 degrees. However, achieving this would bring a significant degree of disruption to the economy. And under this scenario, physical risks will rise very quickly until 2030, and then transition risks will become very significant from 2030 onwards. The third and last scenario is the orderly or early policy action scenario. Now we are looking at the blue line. So this is the best case scenario. There is early and decisive action to reduce global emissions in a gradual way with clearly signposted government policies. Companies and consumers align their behavior with a carbon neutral economy gradually over the horizon, and financial markets price in the transition in an orderly fashion, and they take advantage of the opportunities that the transition provides. In this scenario, there is a macroeconomic shock due to the reallocation of assets, but the shock is quite mild and well controlled. And these actions are sufficient to limit global average temperature increases to below 2 degrees. Now, if we want to be in that best case scenario and achieve our transition goals in an orderly manner, we need to ensure that every professional financial decision takes climate change into account. On this, one of our recent studies on 30 of the largest banks worldwide shows that only 1/3 of the banks surveyed or that we studied incorporate climate change in their risk management frameworks. So we're not there yet. And it's not just about risks. The net zero transition is also a great business opportunity. We need to achieve positive change across all sectors of the economy, not just in small pockets. For that, we need to mobilize the trillions to finance the transition, and public funding can't do it alone, especially in a COVID world with significant strain on public finances. The financial industry will need to scale up its contribution, and we know there is no shortage of capital with years of quantitative easing and low interest rates. We also need to scale up the pipeline of bankable, sustainable opportunities across sectors. And there are plenty of business opportunities. We need to adapt our economies to the impacts of climate change. For example, by improving water availability or developing drought-resistant crops. We also need to mitigate the risk of further climate change by reducing carbon emissions. And that means work and transformation in all sectors of the economy: energy, transport, manufacturing, agriculture. Lastly, we need to find ways of making the capital available and the financing needs meet more efficiently. How? One of the key challenges is to provide investors with decision-useful information. Markets need information to assess which companies can seize the opportunities in a low-carbon economy and which companies are resilient to climate change. And we know that one of the key challenges faced by investors is the lack of good quality, comparable data on companies' environmental performance. To tackle challenges faced around climate reporting, the finance and accounting functions are being brought to the fore. Some have actually gone as far as saying that accountants will lead the green revolution and that they could have a far greater impact than any activist. CFOs have a crucial role to play by finding efficient ways of implementing and complying with the various disclosure standards, defining relevant and meaningful climate metrics for boards and for investor decision-making, and preparing the climate performance report. In addition, external auditors also have a responsibility to play. They need challenge management to assess and report the impact of climate change on their businesses. And in the UK, the Financial Reporting Council has announced a major review of company and auditor responses to climate change. And there are many disclosure standards on environmental information. Here we have, for example, we have the GRI standard launched in 1997. They are broader in scope than some of the other frameworks. We have the CDP that covers climate change, water security, and forestation issues. In 2017, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, set up by the Financial Stability Board of the G20, issued recommendations for addressing climate-related risks and opportunities. And the recommendations really aim to help financial markets, including lenders, insurers, and investors, better assess and price those climate risks and opportunities. And the last one here is the SASB standards. So this is a set of standards issued in 2018, and it covers 77 different industries, and it identifies the minimal set of financially material information, sustainability topics, and metrics for a typical company in a given industry. Out of the multitude of standards available, TCFD is emerging as the preferred standard for climate disclosures. So TCFD is now supported by over 1,027 organizations, representing a market capitalization of over 12 trillion of US dollars. In the UK, the FCA is currently consulting on making TCFD mandatory for listed companies on a comply or explain basis. In the EU, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive recommends the use of TCFD in its non-binding guidelines. And most recently, the Canadian government has announced that TCFD would become mandatory for any companies receiving bailout money due to COVID. So what is TCFD? It is structured around 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. On governance, the typical question is, do the board and management properly monitor and oversee progress in mitigating climate risks and seizing climate opportunities? On strategy, has your organization assessed the impact of climate change on your business and the resilience of your strategy under different climate scenarios? So the focus in this pillar is very much on scenario analysis. And on risk management, has your organization put in place processes and policies to identify, to measure, to monitor, and to manage exposure to climate-related risks? And the last one, metrics and targets. Have you set metrics and targets to assess climate risks and climate opportunities as well, in line with your strategy and your risk management processes? So we looked at the banking industry for our most recent study on climate change, and we found that 43% of banks sampled have started to disclose TCFD information, and another 40% have committed to do so. We have included some highlights here from the 2019 TCFD report available. If we look at scenario analysis, for example, HSBC has announced a partnership with the MIT in the US to produce exploratory transition scenarios. And as I said before, scenario analysis is really the focus on the strategic pillar of TCFD, and it's probably one of the most challenging parts to implement if you want to follow the TCFD standards. So there's a lot of research and development work happening in that space. Looking at client engagement, Lloyds Banking Group customers have been required to explain how they plan to reduce their reliance on revenue from coal. And Lloyds Banking Group is targeting a reduction in its coal revenue to less than 30% by 2025. However, despite the growing support for TCFD and the emerging good practices, the extent and the quality of TCFD disclosures is still uneven, and it's probably going to take many years to achieve comprehensive and qualitative climate risk disclosures from companies. More clarity is needed on the potential financial impact of climate-related issues on companies. If we look at those companies that use scenarios and implement scenario analysis, while they do use scenarios and disclose using those scenario analysis, the majority do not disclose information on the resilience of their strategy, so the result of the scenario analysis. And companies are still early in the process of using climate-related scenarios internally. They are still evolving their approaches. They are learning how to integrate scenarios into strategic planning. So this is really an area for one of the key areas for improvement in terms of implementing TCFD standards. And the last point we have here is the mainstreaming of climate-related issues is going to require to involve more than the sustainability and corporate responsibility functions. We need to go beyond these functions and start involving more actively risk management, finance, and executive management. So I'm just going to wrap up the presentation in a few words. Now, more than ever, it is critical for companies to consider their impact, the impact of climate change on their strategies and operations, and disclose related material information. TCFD is now supported by over 1,027 organizations, as I said before, and that represents over $12 trillion of US dollars in terms of market capitalization. The direction of travel is clear. TCFD is becoming mandatory in the UK for listed companies, in Canada for companies receiving bailout money, and also in other jurisdictions. If you have not started yet, you should definitely consider implementing it now. And I think that would allow you to assess and improve the resilience of your business model and your strategy to climate risks. It would also allow you to identify new business opportunities potentially, and to remain attractive to investors and stay ahead of the curve. The task may seem daunting if you look at the framework and the recommendations from the TCFD in detail, but remember that this is a journey and we all need to start somewhere. So don't let perfection be the enemy of good. So thank you very much for listening, and I would be pleased to take your questions. I think, as Ryan said, it would be at the end of the presentation after Nicola has presented. If you are interested in reading our reports on climate change, they are available to download on our website, on the Mazar website. Don't hesitate to contact me if you want to discuss any of the findings or the contents of the report. Thank you, and I'm handing over back to you now, Ryan.
Thanks, Leila. I thought that was a fantastic presentation, a great overview of where we're at and where we're headed. And I have to be honest, I really love the idea of accountants driving the revolution. Fantastic. So thank you very much, and we'll engage a little bit afterwards once we've heard from Nicola. And so coming up next is Nicola Komnenos, giving us a local perspective, particularly from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Nicola serves as the Group Chief Risk Officer at the JSE. She's a chartered financial analyst, and currently serves, as I've said, as the Group Chief Risk Officer of the JSE. She is Chairman of the JSE Pension Fund Board, Non-Executive Chairman of a fintech startup, and is the Managing Director of Nautilus Group, a hedge fund platform and wholly owned subsidiary of the JSE Group. Nicola represents the JSE on various industry committees, including the WFE, or World Federation of Exchanges, Enterprise Risk Working Group, and the South African Reserve Bank Financial Sector Contingency Forum. Good morning, Nicola. Thanks for joining us this morning, and over to you.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Ryan. I'm going to start off with just sharing my screen. It's lovely to be part of the discussion this morning, and certainly sustainability is very important for us as the exchange. We've been a champion of sustainability really since the start of this jargon being coined, when we still spoke about socially responsible investment. We launched the SRI index, and the terminology has really changed over time. So it's really changed from social responsibility to sustainability, and then we've started talking now about the SDGs, and now we're also talking about other things like what the previous speaker Leila has mentioned around the climate disclosure concepts. So there's a lot of terminology and jargon we love to use in this space, but I'm hoping that I can simplify the view and really just emphasize how important this is for analysts when they look at you as a potential investment. So it really is about how these metrics are used by analysts to evaluate a company. And the key point that was also mentioned by Ryan, that really the analysts are driving the revolution, it's also the investors that are driving it, because the investors are really wanting to see the company's focus on triple bottom line. So no longer just focusing on profits, but also on people and planet. So those three P's being very important, but profit not being the only thing that investors are interested in. They're also wanting to know what the companies are doing from a planet and people perspective. So I wanted to, before I go into the presentation, just ask if I can launch 3 polling questions, because I just wanted to get a sense from the people in the audience around how much their business is focusing on sustainability. So Ryan, if you guys can help me with that. So the first one is your organization aware of sustainability and embeds it in your strategy? So that was the first question, if you can just answer that one. I'm assuming I don't have to be able to answer this. Yeah, it says I cannot vote. And then the second question, so when you're done with the first question, so the first one is really just trying to understand the level of awareness of your company and to the extent that you embed it in your strategy. The second question was just asking specifically to the recent pandemic that we've dealt with, that we're still dealing with in South Africa, COVID-19, to what extent your pandemic response plan included and considered sustainability, which I think is an interesting sort of local context, and also specifically pertaining to crisis management and how you involve sustainability in crisis management. And then the third question was, do you have a dedicated head of sustainability, or do you have some type of specialist in your firm that focuses on sustainability? So those were the 3 questions. If I could ask you to answer those, and then we can post those results. I think this has probably been sufficient time. If Ryan, if you can give me a sense as to whether we need to allow a bit more time for answering the questions, or whether we can post the answers now. There we go. So your organization very much aware, and it's embedded in your strategy, 88%, very interesting number. I have to admit, most of the corporations that we deal with, I think certainly there's awareness in terms of being embedded in the strategy. That would probably be 50-50, depending on the organization and its level of focus. So that's quite interesting to see. In terms of the pandemic response plan, over 50%, 58% said that your organization did include it in your response plan. Very interesting perspective, because I think certainly the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 is one of the critical things to consider. And to me, that is the core and the heart of sustainability. So interesting to see that at least half of you did include that in your response, but there are some that wouldn't have. And I would imagine that this actually ties in with industry. It's probably around half that would have considered the sustainability element, similar to the first question. And then the third one, do you have a dedicated person that looks after sustainability? Also about half of the people. So quite interesting. This does represent roughly what I would have expected. I'm just a bit surprised with that 88% that has embedded sustainability in their strategy, which I think is wonderful. Exactly what we want to see, but not necessarily evident from the conversations I've had. So that's really great feedback. Thank you so much for that. So that was what I just wanted to cover in terms of the start of this presentation. And then I will move on to the next slides. If the technology will work here with me. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I wanted to just cover two elements in my discussion today, really talking about sustainability amid a global pandemic, covering on the socioeconomic landscape, as I've alluded to earlier, specifically considering that we've dealt with COVID-19 and how important sustainability is, especially given the impact post-COVID-19. And then the second point, really the heart of this conversation, is how much value is attributed to sustainability, to your business, if you have considered sustainability as a core element of your strategy. And the answer, the quick and short answer, is just that analysts are looking for those metrics when they're analyzing your company. They really want to know what the qualitative elements are in the E and the S and the G in terms of environmental, social, as well as governance elements. And as I've mentioned, that terminology changes. They're now looking for things like SDGs as well, and your TCFD disclosures. So lots of disclosure required with that the analysts want to see when they look at investing in your business. So the socioeconomic climate, just quickly, I have to echo what Leila has said, that we really have a global revolution on our hands. We've got climate change, and we've got some real global economic impacts that we are seeing. There's some areas globally that are already dealing with very severe weather situations where you've got droughts. We've had our own one just recently in the Western Cape, where you've got floods. Again, we had our own one just recently in KZN. And so you've got real practical impacts. There are things that we call in the financial sector stranded assets, which essentially just means that it's in arable land. You can no longer work there. You have to now move to another area. And so climate change is no longer a risk. It's actually materialized, and there's real incidents. So certainly you can hear that I'm in the camp that's very much convinced that we have to do something about this. So I just wanted to give that quick view, and then adding to the real revolution. It's not all just about climate change. It's also about the social impact, and really looking here specifically the impact of COVID-19, but also just generally anything that happens globally that potentially impacts human rights. So we're talking here about the revolution and the very peaceful protests that are happening in Hong Kong. I was actually very privileged to travel to Hong Kong towards the end of last year, just before the outbreak of COVID-19. It was a little bit earlier. I think it was about around September that I traveled there. And I visited the island, and I actually was in a roadblock in a bus for about an hour, stuck in a bus, because we had a whole bunch of students, predominantly students, about 90% of them were students, very peaceful protests, just had their cell phones out, and they put their little lights on their cell phones. They were standing there, and they actually had masks on, interesting enough. It wasn't COVID-19 masks, it was those gas masks, which was interesting. They were just trying to make a point. And so the revolution carries on. They've been protesting this year too. There's specific things around China's national security laws, which were passed now, 28 May. So this is very recent. And we will see more of that as people feel that human rights is a key element. So this is part of the point that I wanted to make, is when you think about sustainability, it's not just about the planet, it's also about people and really about human rights. And do you allow that expression of your voice, freedom of expression? And then the second revolution that we're seeing now breaking out globally, and our own icon, Trevor Noah, really championing this in America, where there is just really the very shocking killing of George Floyd that recently happened, 25 May. And there really is a lot of practical things happening that actually started taking those statues down. of the oppressors that they had up. Still shocking that they still had those statues up, but really a global campaign around Black Lives Matters. And again, this talks to social inequality, which is part of the social pillar in E, S, and G. So it's the S in the E, S, and G. And I really think because of COVID-19, we've seen things like this. So yes, the Hong Kong revolution happened even before COVID-19, but it's as if the planet has just become more and more aware of those elements that we have to consider other than just profit. So really talking to triple bottom line, focusing on people and planet and not just profits. So that one really close to heart for us as well in South Africa. And our Ambassador Trevor Noah really leading the conversation. They're not being scared to talk about race because it's so important for us to have those conversations so that you can get to the core of it and address the issues. And now coming to how does that all then impact your business? One would think the analysts are just interested in dividends and they're interested in your returns and your profits and how much your business is growing, but they really are interested in a far broader spectrum of elements. And they really want to emphasize your role, and specifically your directors' roles, of the importance of governance of your business and duty of care and stewardship towards your society that you operate within. So I want to just quickly share also, as Leila's already mentioned, what's happening in the UK around mandatory TCFD disclosures for listed companies. So the UK will really lead the way in this regard. So this is very exciting, and we're keeping a close eye on this, and we certainly want to follow very, very closely in those footsteps. At this stage, it's really encouraged, and it's not mandatory in our environment, but TCFD disclosures are becoming so much more important, and specifically just because of the real practical impact of climate change in the South African and African contexts. The reality is it's hitting us hard. And it won't just hit us in terms of the planet heating. It will also hit us in terms of floods and just complete unpredictability of the weather. And that's the challenge that will face all of our various industries in South Africa. And then the other element is I just wanted to show you this report, which is from the Africa SDG Index and Dashboard report from 2019. It just shows the South African context in terms of SDGs and how are we faring in that regard. So for this specific index, we rated 11 out of 52 countries across the continent. And you can see our specific regional score and our specific score for South Africa, not doing badly, but sort of just over 50%. But certainly you'd want us to see and perform a lot better in this regard. And then the next slide just gives you practically the SDG dashboard. So you can see all those 17 sustainable development goals. What do they mean and how are we faring? And you can see, unfortunately, still a lot of red and orange and yellow for South Africa. We haven't addressed the poverty challenge. We haven't reduced inequalities to the extent that we want to do that. We still even haven't addressed hunger, and we've even seen that highlighted in the COVID-19 crisis. So the key message that I just wanted to leave you with is, yes, we have a South Africa context to deal with, and we certainly have an African and continental context to deal with, but we also, as corporates, each one of our individual organizations, whether we're in the public or private sector, each one of our businesses have to really be aware of these sustainable development goals and see how we can improve those. I've certainly seen a number of our listed companies have focused on and chose, maybe they didn't choose all 17, but they chose maybe 3 or 4, and they've actually assigned it to each one of their directors and made them accountable for those specific SDG metrics, and they are tracking those and seeing what success is being made. Standard Bank is a good example of that. So that's the one element, and then the other one, just taking you back to when we as the JSE really started this journey over 20 years ago. We've really been in partnership with Mervyn King as well in terms of the King codes that he's established for integrated reporting, because it's so important to consider your broad stakeholder base. From a sustainability perspective, it's not just about your shareholders. It really is about your broad stakeholder base, which includes your clients, it includes your employees, it includes society at large, everyone you interact with in your business environment. It also includes your suppliers. So off the back of that, and just after our commitment to integrated reporting, we started hard coding some of the King 4 elements in our listing requirements, and we've also launched the FTSE JSE Responsible Investment Index. And so analysts are then able, through this index, to look at those companies that specifically fare well in terms of ESG disclosures. So companies that have disclosed clearly in terms of their environmental impacts, their social impacts, and their governance impact. So this is just a quick summary, a lot of detail on this slide, I'm aware, but I think the key takeaway here is just there's a detailed model behind that index, which essentially analysts use, and they want to know what each one of those data points mean and how your company is faring in this regard. So there's about 300 data points in this model that we use, and all of our listed companies are able to be rated on this depending on whether they meet the criteria of entry level for this specific index. And analysts ask for these results. So we as the JSE are not the only ones that produce this. We've partnered with FTSE in this regard. So again, a UK partnership. So these are the FTSE JSE Responsible Investment Indices, and the companies that are included in here would have a specific ESG rating assigned to them based on a very detailed process where scores and exposures and things are calculated for them. There are also other companies like S&P that also do these types of metrics. And the reality is that analysts are looking for these numbers and they want to know what your company is doing. And just a last point and thought on this, it's not really about the fact that you might be in the tobacco industry, as an example. They want to know, you might be in the tobacco industry, but what are you doing about your impact on the environment, as an example? And what are you doing on your social impact? Are you actually uplifting communities around you, etc.? So yes, you might be producing something that some people would feel is unacceptable, but they'd want to know what are you doing in each one of these elements to give you a good score. So quite interesting, a lot of our mining companies listed on the JSE fare quite well on their ESG ratings, not because, or I suppose the obvious thing is you would think mining, they've got such a bad impact on the environment, but it's because they focus exceptionally, or they put a huge amount of focus on environmental initiatives because they know their impact is so high. So it really is a score to focus on what you can do and what's relevant in your industry. And it's really not supposed to be penalizing you for the industry you're in, because you have to make a living, and we all understand, and all of those businesses are important to contribute to the economy. So we're not exclusionary in any way or form. It's just about what do you then do in your environment, from an environmental, from a social, from a governance element, to make sure that you run a sustainable business. And then I just wanted to leave you as well with just hot off the press. Yesterday, there was a meeting of the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. Our own CEO, Leila Fourie, is the co-chair of that initiative, and they have just announced the massive contribution of about $16 trillion US dollars committed to the Build Back Better for COVID-19. So this is really very important, just talking about how do we take care of the planet? How are we being and working together as leaders in the industry, locally, globally, to make sure that our impact on the environment as well as our people are also considered and not just for profit's sake. So that's just hot off the press, and those are also certainly things to keep an eye out for. So you can take it from this heading, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance really means that there are investors globally that are getting together that want to see certain things from companies. They want to see how companies are focusing on sustainability. And then I wanted to leave you with a last thought in terms of what a future leader really needs to look like. And I found a study that was done by Alliance, and I really found it amazing, just the 4 things that they wanted leaders to be focusing on in the future, which is, yes, you should have a curious mind. You should have curiosity. So certainly have a growth mindset. We can still grow, but we need to have an inclusive mindset as well. So the we concept, it can't just all be for your own profits. It really needs to be triple bottom line focus, considering the planet, people, as well as profit. So profit remains one of the 3 things we want to focus on. And then the second element, really being resilient. As we've seen, COVID-19 has thrown us into a crisis. We've seen the peaceful protests in Hong Kong. They're dealing with a crisis. They've been dealing for a crisis for the last 2 years. And certainly the Black Lives Matter campaign is going to throw us into a global crisis as well. But the challenge is not dealing with the crisis. The challenge is how you respond and what you do in order to now really take the big benefit of that opportunity that was presented by even having that crisis. And then the fourth one is really being flexible. So that talks to the point of really being adaptable and taking a long, hard look at yourself and saying, yes, okay, so maybe I didn't have the right approach. And maybe I do need to have a different perspective going forward. So I thought these were really great in terms of what we as business leaders need to be aware of in terms of being able to run sustainable businesses into the future. So that's my last thoughts, and I've just left this open to questions. I think just one last point would probably just be that there's a great opportunity for businesses to be able to get a bit more training on this. The JSE does have a training academy where we've got a chief sustainability officer, and she'll come do analysis on your company in terms of your readiness. She would compare you to the SDGs, to the SRI index, those types of things. And there's lots of corporates out there that offer those types of things. So I would just say, take up those opportunities because we can all still learn. And certainly we, even ourselves as the JSE, continuously review our own sustainability and our own approach. So that's it from my side. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicola. We've had such fantastic presentations today. We've just burned through the time, but I've certainly enjoyed these presentations, and they certainly have provided enormous food for thought. We have a few minutes left, I think, maybe just to have a little bit of a discussion. And by the way, it's fantastic to see the JSE leading the charge on an international stage, really driving the sustainability conversation. The SDGs actually have a 2030 target, and that leaves us with a little bit less than 10 years to actually achieve many of those substantial goals. And I believe the UN has termed this the decade of action, and maybe the COVID pandemic really reinforces that notion and provides a sense of urgency that we so desperately need. I'm also reminded that South Africa still currently has the highest Gini coefficient on the planet, making us the most unequal country, and that certainly is not sustainable. But nevertheless, a great question has come through from Avos, who's all the way out in George in the Western Cape, and he's sort of taking a sobering view on banks and the manner in which banks provide loan financing. And I guess this one is coming at you, Leila. And so he's sort of saying, when considering loan applications, banks tend to place a high value on assets that entrepreneurs, for example, may have to secure that loan. And it's often impossible to access finance without suitable collateral, which inhibits not only general entrepreneurial activity, but particularly social entrepreneurship, which seeks to address the needs of community or society at large, rather than merely driving profits for shareholders. Right? And so his question is, what would it take, or is it even a consideration for banks to start assessing loan applications differently and distributing money in areas and ways that address societal needs and the change that needs to happen? And those needs include everything from clean air, water, education, social inequality, and so on. How do we start distributing money in the areas where it's most needed, as opposed to where it can most quickly replicate itself?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think obviously there is we can see there's a big momentum in the banking industry with the UN principles for responsible banking that were launched last year. And I think probably close to 200 signatory banks across the world now. So there is, I think, increasingly a willingness for banks to embrace these social issues. But we also need to remember that it's a regulated industry. And you don't, as a bank, you don't just grant loans because you think it's nice to grant loans somewhere. You need to be compliant with your capital requirements and regulation, that is set by the regulatory authorities. So if you need to be able to demonstrate that you're granting loans in a safe and in a sound manner, and you need to assess the level of creditworthiness of the borrowers. So I think there is going to be, but that's not to say that it's not. There's no way of solving the issue. I think banks need to become a bit innovative, and they are working on that. We are seeing the emergence of sustainability-linked loans, for example, where banks are actually attaching sustainability targets to loan contracts. So it's more in the environmental space. So you can say, for example, if you commit to reducing your carbon emissions and greening your activity, the interest rates are going to decrease over time. So, and that's because banks have been able to establish the link between the decrease in your level of carbon emissions and your creditworthiness. So as you decrease your impact, you become more creditworthy, and then it makes sense commercially. I think that's the challenge. Banks need to find a way of linking to. They can't just do these things without having, the good. It needs to make sense commercially and business wise.
Yeah, I guess large-scale structural change doesn't come easily, and it comes with a bit of pain, and there are no easy solutions. But I think as we drive an increasing commitment to actually start looking for solutions and ways to fix an unsustainable trajectory, I think we start making some headway. Nicola, you mentioned that a lot of investors are starting to demand increasingly sustainable investment and sustainable business practice and so on. And I guess the question is, and Leila, you've mentioned sort of regulatory constraints and so on. And so the next question was, who should drive the required change? Is this a matter for central banks and policymakers only? Or should it be driven by a sense of shareholder or investor conscience? Is there a role for the corporate sector to take in leading the charge?
Yeah, if I can maybe add, I think there are certainly certain stakeholders that are pushing. So there's an opportunity for a variety of leaders to step up here. But I think just from my perspective, I also chair the JSE Pension Fund, and I've worked in the pension fund industry for a long time. I'm seeing actually a lot of change being pushed by those pension fund boards themselves, because they want to see that their investments are a lot more sustainable. They've really burnt their fingers with Steinhoff because of the governance issues there. And they are pushing for ESG disclosures now. And they're saying, I want to know that you as an analyst are not just investing in that corporate because it's got great profit opportunities. I want to know that you're comfortable with the governance of this company. I want to know that you're comfortable with what it's doing on the environmental side and what it's doing from a societal side. Because they really have now seen practically what that could mean. And it really is becoming more of a risk management tool as opposed to necessarily looking at opportunities. But on the other hand, there certainly are a lot of opportunities. I've also seen some of the much larger pension fund boards also saying they now want to focus on what they're really calling social impact investments, which is where they want to see, they only want to invest in projects where they can actually practically see you've come in that community, you've given them running water as an example. And then if I can get the evidence of your real social impact on the ground, then I will invest in your project. And they're going as far to say they'll allocate 10, 20% of their total capital to those types of social impact investments. And they're partnering there with the development finance institutions, which are really government funded. So it really is a partnership, in my view, between government and policymakers. So we've also just seen recently that locally the financial it used to be the FSB. It's now our FSCA, has just changed all their regulations for pension funds that have included an element of sustainability disclosure. So the regulators are even coming to the party to say the pension fund should be looking at the sustainability element. So I think there's a partnership, but certainly opportunity for others to step in as well.
That's fantastic to hear. I mean, and I guess at the end of the day, it requires a collaborative effort. It needs all of us to keep the conversation alive. I mean, you rightfully mentioned that last year governance was really brought to the spotlight within a South African context, and certainly through Steinhoff, but they weren't the only one last year. We had a number of fairly significant corporate governance failures last year, which interestingly enough also shifted the narrative, where the private sector had always sort of pointed a finger at government and said, where's government accountability and governance and all of that kind of thing. But I thought what that brought to light very clearly for everyone in South Africa was the extent to which private sector is complicit in many of the challenges that we are seeing in society as well. I've just seen actually that time has really run away from us, and we've just moved over to 11 o'clock, but I see there's been one more question that has just come through, and this is a question for Nicola, and I'll just read it as it's come through. Many listed businesses are mastering publishing award-winning glossies with very little authenticity or care for the social and environmental factors. Any plans from the JSE to drive this harder so that our economy becomes more sustainable? I guess they're referring to the physical printed glossies and sort of sales material that's become so common.
No, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we quite strongly feel that all of those should be purely electronic. And again, I actually think COVID-19 has really pushed us sort of over the edge in terms of that. I just think practically in terms of our pension fund board, all of our documentation now has to be electronic. So yes, we as the JSE, we actually took a very brave step a number of years ago that we got into a lot of trouble on from all of the local media houses. We said that it's no longer mandatory for listed companies to get their information published in newspapers. So I don't know if people remember that, but we certainly are environmentally conscious. We don't want to mandate for things to be published and printed. So it's not a mandatory requirement from us at all for these things to be published and printed. I hear you that the listed companies still do that. I think unfortunately, there is still this human element of paper and a book and holding that. Similar to our human element of we really don't like to talk via these webinar things. We'd rather sit in the same room and have the conversation and be able to eyeball each other. But this gives us the opportunity for me in Johannesburg and you in Cape Town and Layla in London to all get together and actually have a conversation. So I think it's all change management, it's behavior change. But certainly we will continue to lead the charge there, as unpopular as we might be, but fully agree with your speaker that's asked the question. We are fully behind him.
So, there are lots of little things as well as the big step changes that we need to make. There are little incremental changes that all of us have the ability to make, even within our own businesses, to really start driving towards a more positive future. So on that note, unfortunately, we're going to have to end. Massive thanks, Leila and Nicola, for your insights and your presentations today. I found it really fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this sustainability conversation with Mazars. So thank you very much to both of you for your insights. Massive thanks to Mazars for the series, and of course, as usual, to all attendees. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, for being part of the conversation, for your interaction, and for taking an interest in sustainability, which I think is in all of our interests going forward. So on that note, I wish you all a fantastic day. Have a great, sustainable, focused day, and we look forward to engaging you at the next one. Cheers.